All right. Hey, welcome everybody back to session number 4 in the series that we're going over about how God has made himself available to all mankind throughout human history. We're going over how God has established his relationship with mankind and some of the steps that the Bible shows us that took place as God continues to draw all men to him. That if those that would humble themselves and give up their own pride and seek after God and follow him and to search him out to find him, how we've always been able to do that throughout human history. And there's never been a time when that wasn't available to mankind. Even today, we could all witness that we have had the ability to come to God, to learn about God, to seek him out and to find him. We know that very well today, but I think having a better understanding on how that has always been available will give us better understanding of the love of God towards mankind that he has always had without fail. Today, I'm kind of excited about this lesson because we're going to talk about Abraham, and this is a critical point in the story of the Bible as it's talking about the relationship that God has had with mankind. Because at this particular point, everything slows down a little bit and it focuses on this one man and his family. Because God was going to do something great that was going to affect the whole world. Up until this point, hundreds of years go by fairly quickly as the chapters through the Bible go. The first portion of the book, up until chapter 12, it covers thousands of years of human history. God is starting a new work as mankind is beginning to die of old age. Because you have to remember that up until this time, everybody that had been born after the flood was still alive. No one had died of old age anyway up until this point. Peleg was the first person that the Bible mentions to have died of old age. And he doesn't die until Abraham is in his 40s. And Noah was still alive during this time that Abraham was born. Abraham was in his 50s when Noah died. So Abraham likely could have learned a lot from Noah. Noah's son Shem and then Shem's grandson Eber, they would outlive Abraham. They would live until the time of Jacob. And so this is the perfect time for God to raise Abraham's family up and to start creating a special people that's going to minister to the Lord and bless all nations of the earth. They had a huge task that was ahead of them, and God almost made sure that they would have guidance to raise them up before the ancient people that lived a long time prior to the flood, before they were all going to die out. They were going to witness this family being brought up that God had chosen and set apart from all the nations of the earth to be a special blessing to people. And we're going to kind of look at how that started as we look at Abraham. Now, one of the reasons why I believe that Abraham did in fact learn from Noah, Shem, possibly Eber as well, is because we see that his father was not necessarily the best influence. As we see in Joshua chapter 24 and 2, it says, "And Joshua said unto all the people, Thus saith the Lord God of Israel, Your fathers dwelt on the other side of the flood in old times, even Terah, the father of Abraham and the father of Nahor, and they served other gods." So we see that idolatry was still a big problem, even for Abraham's own father, Terah. Now we'll also see through the characters of the Bible that they served idols. It was a weakness that people had. But many people, even though they would worship idols and follow after idolatrous worship, they still had a fear and a reverence for the one true God. In their heart, people knew who the one true God was. But there are certain things that entice mankind to follow other evil practices, the lust of our heart, the desires that we have, covetousness, things that we would rather do than obey God. We see it plenty today. It might not be in the form of an idol, but we see clearly the things that distract us from God. It was no different back in this time. But Abraham walked with God, and God saw his righteousness. And God makes a covenant with Abraham. We see early on in Genesis 12, 1 through 3, we see the relationship begin. The story of Abraham begins. And it begins with a covenant. God makes a promise to Abraham as he is about to send him out of his country to a new land that God was going to show him. And he was going to give him a variety of, a series of promises. He was going to promise him a special land, a special people. His family would grow. In Genesis chapter 12, 1 through 3, we see, "Now the Lord had said unto Abraham, Get thee out of thy country, and from thy kindred, and from thy father's house, into a land that I will show thee. And I will make of thee a great nation, and I will bless thee, and make thy name great, and thou shalt be a blessing. And I will bless them that bless thee, and curse him that curseth thee, and in thee shall all families of the earth be blessed." Now that is huge, because not only is God making a covenant with Abraham here, he's making a promise to all the families of the earth right here, that through this man Abraham, all families of the earth are going to be blessed through him. It's a promise to all mankind here. And there was going to be a special people that was going to be raised up. An incredible blessing to the world. We know them as the Israelites, the Jews, the Jewish nation. They were a very special people, very dear to God. And we'll see as we go through our study how the world would witness them and to view them and to see how they lived, to teach people about the one true God so that others could be drawn to God. And we'll talk a lot about that in the future. Now we'll see that right off the bat, Abraham is having an impact on the nations around him. He's making a name for himself. People are watching him, and they're looking at what he does, and they're learning from him. And we see right off the bat, through his travels, there's a famine in the land, and he goes in the land of Egypt. And he's concerned because he knows that many people are falling into idolatry. Many people don't fear the Lord. There's violence in the land, some of which we'll talk about here in a little bit. And he tells the Egyptians that Sarah is his sister and not his wife, because he fears that they're going to kill him to take his wife. And they do see Sarah, and they take Sarah, and they bring Sarah to Pharaoh. And Pharaoh thinks that he's going to take Sarah to be his wife. And we see the Lord do a miraculous thing. He punishes Pharaoh with plagues. And Pharaoh realizes that these plagues are from God. And but he understands that. So we see that we know that Pharaoh, or the Egypt, was into idolatry worship. We know, many of us have heard of the Egyptian false gods that they worshipped. They're fairly well known. And yet we see a reverence for God as well. It's like they want to worship how they want to worship, even though they know that there is only one true God, and with him is the real power. And we see that the Egyptians and Pharaoh lets Abraham go. And he actually receives cattle and some riches out of the situation. And he goes his way. And then we see another story as he goes into the land of the Philistines, and he begins a relationship with Abimelech. A relationship that actually continues to grow. And he takes his wife Sarah, and again he says that Sarah is his sister because he fears the wickedness of the people. But then he finds something interesting here. Abimelech does take Sarah, his wife. And then the Lord comes to Abimelech in a dream. The Lord actually spoke to Abimelech in a dream, which shows that the concern that God had to this people. And he warns Abimelech that if he errs, that his people are going to be in trouble. And through this, we see the mercy of God that he had to people, to other nations. And we also see that as Abimelech gives Sarah back to Abraham and listens to Abraham and then asks Abraham to pray for him, that he was willing to do what God had told him to do. Now, there was also idolatry in the land of the Philistines. They had their flaws. But we also see here that they did know about God, and they were able to make a choice to serve God or to serve the idols of the land. We actually see them moving towards, or them correcting some of their sins. And we'll see that later on down the road, when Isaac goes into the same place, how they don't take Rebekah, Isaac's wife. They watch from a distance to see what happens, and then they realize that they are married, and they know full well that you don't take another man's wife. It's like they learned the lesson from Abraham on how not to sin, and that actually stuck for the Philistines during this time. We also see the patience of God towards all people here, because God does make a promise with Abraham that he was going to give him and his descendants the land of Canaan. But we see that he's not going to do that yet, and we see why in Genesis chapter 15 and verse 16. It says, "But in the fourth generation they shall come hither again, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet full." So God was still being patient with the Amorites at this time, and many of the Canaanites as well. He was going to give them a time to repent, to leave their evil ways, and to come to God. And there was also another land that had grown increasingly wicked during this time. Many of us have heard the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. That was a sign to the whole world that God is the God of the world. He judges all nations of the earth. He has all power and authority to judge, but he loves people, and he wants to show people the error of their ways so people can come to him. And there was this increasingly wicked city. The abominations of Sodom and Gomorrah were very great. And it came to the point where their destruction was imminent because of all the sins that they had committed. And as a matter of fact, only Lot and his family were found righteous in that entire city. And Abraham would plead for Sodom and Gomorrah that God would not overthrow the city if he would find a number of righteous people in the city. It started with 50, then 40, then 20, then 10. And God would said each time that if he found that many people, all the way down to 10 righteous people, he would show mercy on the entire city for the sake of that 10 or those 10 people. But not even 10 righteous people were found in the entire city. It was so far gone. And God rained down brimstone and destroyed the entire city, Sodom and Gomorrah. And only Lot was saved from that destruction. But all the world saw that. All the world witnessed that. Everybody had a reality check at that point in time that sin is punished by God. God is a loving God. He's very patient, but he is a just God. And during this time as well, in the time of Abraham's life, there was still a large majority of the earth's population that had been born after the flood that was able to witness this. And now we get to the most incredible story of Abraham, in my opinion. This is when Abraham was tested with his greatest test of all. He was given a son. Him and his wife were having troubles having a son. Sarah was unable to have children. And at the age of 90 years old, when Abraham was 100 years old and Sarah was 90 years old, God blessed them with a son, and his name was Isaac. Now, Abraham loved his son, and in the course of time, God tested Abraham, and he said in Genesis 22, 1 through 2, it said, "And it came to pass after these things that God did tempt Abraham, and said unto him, Abraham. He said, Behold, here I am. And he said, Take now thy son, thine only son Isaac, whom thou lovest, and get thee into the land of Moriah, and offer him there a burnt offering upon one of the mountains which I will tell thee of." And he had a choice to make. Now, another really interesting thing that happens here, this is the very first time in the Bible that the word love is mentioned, as God is talking about Abraham's love for his son Isaac. Now, you may have heard of the rule of first mention, how the first time a word is mentioned in the Bible kind of displays how the Bible views the word as a definition of that word. And what's really interesting is this whole scenario with Abraham and Isaac and offering him on Mount Moriah, it's a direct reflection of what Christ did for us. The whole story is a picture of what God was going to do through Jesus Christ, his son. All the promises, the way the whole thing is acted out. And this is the perfect place for love to show up for the first time, because it directly goes into John 3:16. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten son, that whosoever believeth in him should not perish, but have everlasting life. This is exactly the love that God had for the earth. And this was a reflection of what that love was what the cost of that love was gonna be. The death of Jesus Christ for our sins. So let's look at that. So let's look at how they even approached the mountain. This too has parallels to what Christ, on how Christ was crucified. Genesis 22:6 says, "And Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it upon Isaac his son. And he took the fire in his hand and a knife, and they both went them together." When Christ was walking towards the cross, he also carried the wood for the sacrifice. And also, as we see here, Abraham gave the wood to Isaac, his son, to walk up the mountain with. A lot of people, when you hear the story about how Abraham offered Isaac on the mountain, they portray Isaac as being a young boy, where he was most likely around his 30s during this time. As you can see, he's carrying all the wood up a mountain. He was a grown man. Shortly after this occurs, we see the death of Sarah comes quickly afterwards. And we know Sarah was 127 when she died. So Isaac would have been around 37 years old when Sarah died. So he would have been able to overpower Abraham. Abraham was an old man by this time. Abraham was 100 years old when Isaac was born. So he would have been much older than that by the time this happened. If Isaac was not willing to be sacrificed, he could have overpowered Abraham most likely very easily. So we see that there was a willingness of Isaac to be sacrificed. So we both see obedience from Abraham. We also see obedience from Isaac here. And we also see that as a reflection to Christ's willingness to be sacrificed for the sins of the world on our behalf. And many of us know the story, how at that critical moment, the angel of the Lord stopped Abraham. And he said, "Don't harm Isaac." Abraham had proved himself faithful. He believed God, and he was willing to sacrifice everything he loved for God. That he loved nothing more in this world than God Almighty. He loved the Lord his God with all his heart, with all his soul, with all his might. Of everything that he was, he served God. And that turned out to be a great blessing for all mankind. As we see here in Genesis 22:13 through 14, there was a substitute that was made for Isaac. He said, "And Abraham lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, behind him a ram caught in the thicket by his horns. And Abraham went and took the ram and offered him up for a burnt offering instead of his son. And Abraham called the name of the place Jehovah Jireh. As it is said, to this day, in the mount of the Lord it shall be seen." That's incredible. And Jehovah Jireh means the Lord will provide. And then we see again, the Lord makes a promise to Abraham that the whole world would be blessed through his descendants. In Genesis 22:16 and 18, it says, "By myself I have I sworn, saith the Lord, for because thou hast done this thing, and hast not withheld thy son, thine only son, that in blessing I will bless thee, and in multiplying I will multiply thy seed as the stars of the heavens, and as the sand which is upon the seashore, and thy seed shall possess the gates of his enemies. And in thy seed shall all the nations of the earth be blessed, because thou hast obeyed my voice." The Lord was starting something incredible on this mountain. This is one of the most incredible moments in all of human history. It was a direct picture of what Christ was going to do. And the place, this particular place, would continue to be the focal point of many of the promises of God. The major promises of God that would affect the whole world were right here. Not only would this be the future city of Jerusalem being built around these mountains, this was the same place that Solomon built the temple of the Lord. As we see in 2 Chronicles 3:1, it says, "Then Solomon began to build the house of the Lord at Jerusalem, in Mount Moriah, where the Lord appeared unto David his father, in the place that David had prepared in the threshing floor of Ornan the Jebusite." But along the ridge of this mountain, 700 meters from where the Temple Mount is today, at the highest point of this mountain, is a place called Golgotha, or also known as Calvary. And thousands of years later, this is where Christ would be crucified for the sins of all the world. But there was no ram to take his place. As we see, Christ was the lamb to be slain. And just like the ram was caught in the thicket as the substitute ram that was sacrificed in place of Isaac, we see the Son of God with his head caught in the thorns, walking up the Mount Moriah with the wood for the offering on his shoulders. A direct picture of what happened during the time of Abraham as he offered Isaac up. And he did sacrifice himself. The Son of God was sacrificed for the sins of the world. And greater love had no man than the love that God had for us. And the fact that pivotal moment in our history when the sins of the world were forgiven, the love that was shown there, and how this was prophesied, and the picture of this sacrifice was given to us in Genesis through the story of Abraham sacrificing his son Isaac, and how that was the first mention of love in the Bible. It's so fitting that the first time love was used in the Bible was to show us what Christ was going to do for us. And I truly believe that Abraham knew full well what was happening here. He understood the promise of God. As we read in John 8:56 through 58, when Jesus is talking to the Pharisees, he says, "Your father Abraham rejoiced to see my day. And he saw it, and was glad. Then the Jews said unto him, Thou art not 50 years old, and hast thou seen Abraham? Jesus said unto them, Verily, verily, I say unto you, before Abraham was, I am. And Abraham spread this good news. Because we read in Genesis 22:14, we'll read it again, and Abraham called the name of that place Jehovah Jireh, which means the Lord will provide. As it is said to this day, in the mount of the Lord it shall be seen. You see, the Bible says, as it is said to this day. The Bible says, as it is said to this day, meaning the people are still talking about this. People had learned from Abraham what was happening and what this vision meant. And then we see the words, in the mount of the Lord it shall be seen. We see this as a prophecy that was fulfilled by Jesus Christ, because in the mount, that mount of the Lord, it was seen as Christ paid for the sins of the world through his sacrifice. And we see that Abraham passed this information on, and it was going from generation to generation, the great promises of God. In chapter 22 in Genesis is a picture and a witness of what Christ would do for the world. And I think it's very clear as you look at it, the symbolism, the parallels, the imagery. Christ fulfilled the promises in Genesis chapter 22 and started a promise to the whole world that through Abraham and his family, these promises were going to be fulfilled, and all nations of the world would be blessed. And this promise started with Abraham and his family, and we're going to see how that plays out throughout the history, how this pivotal point in human history started a remarkable chain of events that would change the entire world. We're also going to see how God adds on to his promises as the story continues. The story of God loving the human race and drawing as many to him as would obey and would humble themselves and serve and follow God. God bless you all, and I'll talk to you next time.